Good morning. A very warm welcome to all the learners, teachers, educators to CIT NCERT's live phone-in program. I, Kriti Vadhera, would like to tell you here that this session is going to be very interesting. It's for 10th class students and it's a follow-up session. We have already taken this session last week where we discussed about the chapter Our Environment. It's a part 2 of the session, and the expert who has joined us for this discussion, I would like to introduce Dr. C.V. Shimre. Good morning. We welcome you to Kishore Manch. And before we start with today's discussion, I would like to remind our viewers that in between this live interaction program, you can ask questions to our expert. Feel free to dial on our toll-free numbers. Our numbers would be 1800111265 and the other number is 1800112199. You can also send your questions and queries via email. Our email address is ciet.kishoremanch@gmail.com. And to watch the live streaming of this program, kindly log into our official YouTube channel NCERT official, and there also in the live chat box you can comment and ask questions to our expert. We will make each and every effort to answer back your questions in the last segment of the program. So starting with today's interaction program, Dr. Shimre, I would like you to give us a quick review of what we discussed in last interaction.
Yeah, sure. So let me take you through the slides that we showed the previous session. So can you please take us to the slides? So there we have. So in the last previous session, we discussed about what topics are there in the chapters. For example, the topics that I have listed down, all these topics are there except for the one that is in brown color. So I am going to add this topic, although you have studied this global warming in class 9 as part of your carbon cycle, but still I'm going to take this session maybe next time. So these are the topics that you have in this chapter. Then we also discuss about few things. What happened after post-independence? Last session was it was on the day of Independence Day, and so we discussed about how things changed, the environment changed. I mean, how have we done with what have we done with the environment since independence? So we discussed about all that. We discussed a little bit about what Gandhiji's thoughts were about sustainable development and how he thought about development in itself. Then we also talk about how things have changed, how because of our attempt to develop have caused us to a certain extent in the degradation of the environment. So that's what we discussed, and we also talked a little bit about how the world had also changed in their in the way they think about the environment. Everybody felt the need to take care of the environment. That was what we discussed the previous time. And also we discussed about a few things that had happened. For example, people became more aware, like we had some people coming up, and like the Chipko movement that came up, and other kinds of kinds of movements, civil society movements, which showed that people were interested to have a good environment, which is good for everyone. So we discussed about that. We also discussed about a few things, how education itself has changed. I mean, the way we take environment in education itself, we discussed about that, and that we discussed that we have been highlighting about environment more so now than it was before, soon after independence. But today, we're doing a lot about environment. We're trying to make students aware about the environment in different ways, in different subject disciplines. So that's what we discussed. We also discussed about what the Constitution of India, includes or addresses about the environment. So the importance of environment has been highlighted even in the Constitution of India. So that is one of the articles that I mentioned last time. So there are things that has happened over the years. So that the previous session was more of an introductory part of this chapter itself. And so today we are going to get into the real chapter, that means the content of the chapter. So we discussed also a little bit about what was Biosphere 2 about. It was an attempt to study how a man-made ecosystem in the form of this Biosphere 2. Biosphere 2, it was so named because Biosphere 1 is the existing Earth, and so Biosphere 2 was a man-made one. So this was a facility which was set up, a closed facility depicting whatever is present on the earth, the different ecosystem present on the earth, it was depicted in this closed enclosure in US, in Arizona, near Tucson. So the scientists tried to study what exactly happens in the system when they tried to depict that in a closed system. So they came up with some findings, like they found that things did not really work, oxygen level reduced in spite of having all kinds of plants in there, and so they had to pump in some extra oxygen into that. So, and there are a few things like some animals, for example the cockroach, survived and thrived, or some plants overtook the rest of the plants. So that's one of the things that they found out. But ultimately what was interesting to them is that they found that ecosystem is complicated. It's not so easy to have all these things right and then everything will go right, in spite of having all the things or all the components that they thought was required for the ecosystem to run as a self-sustaining system. In spite of that attempt, they found that things did not really work, so ecosystem is more complicated than they thought. So that was the ultimate finding. So then today, so what we're going to discuss today, let's come to this today's topic. So we're going to discuss about certain terminologies.
Okay.
Certain terminologies. For example, there are different terms that are used, which will come to that. Then we're going to discuss a little bit about components of an ecosystem, how ecosystem function, and what is the role of an ecosystem. So these are some of the topics that we are going to try to cover. Okay.
Right.
So let us get started with the terminologies. So let's start with the first term, biosphere. See, this is the, I have already used the word biosphere even in the previous session. So what is this biosphere? So as you can see in that slide, it is a total area on earth where living things are found. That means that every place where you can find living things or living organisms that constitute the biosphere. So in a way we can say that it is a sum total of all the ecosystem. So that makes up the biosphere. So it is a sum total of area on earth, which can be in the air, which can be in the, on the land, which can be in water, you know. So all the sum total of those places where organisms are found. So that's called biosphere. Then there's another term, biome. Biome is also a word which students might have come across several times as they read newspapers or even in some textbooks that they might have read. So it's important to understand what this biome is. So biome is a portion of the biosphere. So it is a portion of that biosphere which has distinct climate, and it has distinct or particular assemblage of plants and animals which are adapted to that place. So it is a portion of the biosphere, it has distinct climate, it has several plants and animals which are adapted to that place. And biosphere is broadly categorized into three: terrestrial, marine, and freshwater. So those are the broad categorization of biomes. So an entire biome itself may be considered an ecosystem. And this can be further divided into subgroups, smaller groups, and again subgroups. For example, when I say an entire biome itself may be considered as an ecosystem, is that we have heard about the term terrestrial ecosystem. Here we have mentioned that biomes are broadly divided into terrestrial, marine, and freshwater. But we also use the term sometimes terrestrial ecosystem. So biomes can, may be considered an ecosystem itself, an entire biome. So again, further divisions can happen. For example, under the terrestrial biome, we can say that there is this terrestrial forest can be a biome. Under that forest, there are different kinds of forests. For example, the dry tropical forest or the tropical rainforest again. So you can keep on subdividing those categories, but the broad categories are like terrestrial, marine, and freshwater. So these are the three broad categories of biome. Then let's come to the term ecosystem. So what is this ecosystem? An ecosystem includes all the living organisms in a given area plus the non-living components of the physical environment. And the most important word here is interact. These living organisms and the non-living components, they interact. So that defines ecosystem. It is the interaction of all living and non-living things in a place. So it can be very small, ecosystem can be huge. For example, it can be this whole ocean can be an ecosystem, or it can be this small portion that I have highlighted. This is a tide pool. That means during low tide you have this kind of place where the water kind of becomes stagnant, and so it in itself forms a kind of ecosystem. So an ecosystem can be as small as this tide pool, or it can be of this kind. An ecosystem can be like this forest, dense forest, or it can be like this, a wetland, or it can be a desert ecosystem where you don't see any organism, but definitely there are organisms living in there. For example, insects will be there, snakes will be there, or other burrowing animals will be definitely there in that, although you cannot see there. So there are different kinds of, types of ecosystem, which can be small and which can be big. So what about community? Again, community is a term which we use normally in our daily life also. So when we say community, what do we mean by that? So it is defined as all the populations, that means plants, animals and other species living and interacting in an area. So it includes all the living organisms which interact amongst each other. So for example, when I say community, it's going to be like in an aquatic ecosystem, for example, a lake. Let us take an example of a lake. In a lake, there are different kinds of organisms there. You have plants, you have you have fishes, you have other insects, you have frogs and things like that. So in a community, you have different kinds of organisms belonging to different groups. It can be plants, it can be different kinds of animals, which can be big animals, bigger animals, fishes, or tiny insects or microbes. So it can be all those kinds, but it consists of the living component of an ecosystem of the population. So then, since we have used the term population in the definition of community, we would like to define what population is. So how do we define population? Population is a group of individuals belonging to the same species, living and interacting in the same region. So it is a group of individuals of the same species living and interacting in the same population. So when we use the term population, we say population of dogs, population of human beings, population of cats, or population of trees, a certain tree. We never say that a mix, when we never say the term. I mean the organisms.
Oh, organisms.
Yeah, so we don't say that cats and human beings population. We don't say that.
Yeah.
So when you use the term population, it is about a same species. So how many cats are there? How many dogs are there? How many human beings are there?
Right.
So that indicates
we talk
population.
Categorically.
Yes.
Yeah.
So it is specific. So that's what. So students should not confuse with this term, because when you say community, it includes all kinds of organisms.
As a whole.
Yes.
Okay.
So all the living organisms in that place.
Yeah.
So that is a community. But
Community.
when you say population, it is of the same species.
Same species.
So very, these are the nuances that
Thin lines.
Yes, students have to be careful
We
about.
have to
People tend to
Yeah.
wrongly use these words. Use community anytime. So being a student, a science student, so it will be good for them to get familiarized with these terms, so that in future also, if they take
and these are
biology.
very commonly used words in day-to-day life also. We tend
Yes.
to use community, population.
That's right. So
Yeah.
since it is so commonly used, so we tend to wrongly use them
Right,
also. So
right,
that's the thing.
absolutely.
So it's important for students to be a little bit careful when they use this term. So when they refer to community, they should refer to all different kinds of organisms living in that place. So, but when they say population, they should mean the same species, So that's something that they might want to know. Then individual. So what is this individual? Individual is like, it's a single member of that population. So like individual, a person in that whole population of human beings. So that's individual. Let me take you to a very interesting picture slide which depicts all those terms that I have just mentioned, right? For example, as you can see in that slide, it starts with, on the top right, biosphere. So as we already defined biosphere, what is that biosphere? It is the sum total of the places on Earth where life exists. So biosphere, as you can see on the extreme right corner, it includes a sum total of all the places where life exists. It could be on land, it could be in water, or it could be in air, because you have air in the air, birds flying, or even some organisms there in the air. Then there are so many different organisms in water. There are so many different organisms on land or in the soil. So that constitutes the biosphere. From the biosphere, as you can see there is a term coming out, biome. So again, as we define, biome is a distinct, biome has a distinct climate, as we just defined a few minutes back. So it is a portion of the biosphere with a distinct climate. And the organisms, plants and animals living there are adapted to that place. So it has certain uniqueness in that. So biome is a portion of that biosphere with distinct climate, with unique organisms, plants and animals which are adapted to that place. Then from that biome, we bring out this term called ecosystem. So a biome, as we said, it can be big, it can be small again, and it can be, the whole biome can be considered as an ecosystem. But still then, if we break down this biome, then you can find a different ecosystem. For example, we define ecosystem as interaction of biotic and abiotic components in a place. So that's an ecosystem, as you can see in the picture there. You can see all the trees there, the birds there, some animals in there. So these are not real pictures. So although this map represents some portion of Australia, not necessarily these pictures are like, for example, the birds that I have put up there or the animals that I have put up there. Most of them belong to Australia, but not necessarily. Just to depict ecosystem, I have put up those pictures. So what is important here is that in this ecosystem, there are different organisms there, and although you cannot see the environment abiotic components, so it also includes the abiotic components when you say ecosystem. Then from the ecosystem, we take this word community. So community, as we just mentioned, it includes all the populations, all living organisms in a population. So all the living organisms constitute the community. For example, as you can see there, again, all the living organisms, plants and animals and birds are still there. So that constitutes the community. Then if you see below the community circle, you'll see a particular bird, the same bird I have depicted to depict population. As we said, population are individuals of the same species. So this picture with the circle with the same birds, the same bird, that depicts population. Whereas in the last picture, there is just one bird there. So that that depicts individual of a population. So that wholly, I mean, in a nutshell, this picture explains all those terms that we just mentioned: biosphere, biome, ecosystem, community, population, and individual. So this clearly depicts how we can relate to each of these terms, you know. So let's move ahead. So there are more terms coming up. For example, species. We have just used the word species. Species word, this term, students are very familiar with it. They have used several times. They have understood the definition also. They have learned about the definition also. And few sessions back, few months back, we discussed about species definition in the heredity and evolution chapter. So when we define species, what is important is those individuals, organisms should be able to interbreed amongst themselves naturally. They should be able to interbreed among themselves naturally and also produce viable offspring. So that's important. So naturally they should be able to interbreed, because by, I mean, we can manipulate, and we can manipulate and try to interbreed different species. So that's not going to the way we define species. But if you say species, they should be able to naturally interbreed amongst themselves. Then there's another term they will come across, habitat, which is very common again. So what is this habitat? It is a physical environment in which individuals of a particular species can be found. So it is a place where organisms live. In short, again, they have studied about habitat from class 6. So it is a place where organisms are found, the physical environment where organisms are found, that is called habitat. Then there is another term called niche or niche. So what is this niche or niche? It is the role a species plays in its community. including how it gets its energy, nutrients, its habitat requirements, and what other species and parts of the ecosystem it interacts with. You know, for example, a lake is a habitat. You know, it's an aquatic habitat. A lake is an aquatic habitat, but there's so many organisms living there. So you say that, okay, a lake is a habitat for fishes, a lake is a habitat for maybe even for frog, you know. But when you say niche or niche, then you talk in terms of its role. For example, you'll find that in a lake itself, some plants will be living at the bottom, you know, some plants will be floating, some insects will be on the top portion, doing something else, feeding on something else. The role will be different, you know, so it's a different kinds of role that it plays in that particular habitat. Okay. So when you say habitat, it's about the physical space, you know, the place.
Right.
But when you say niche or the niche, then we talk about in terms of its role. How it gets its nutrients, how it gets its energy, how it interacts with other organisms or non-living things that's there in that habitat. So its interaction and its role in that ecosystem or the habitat, you know. So those are the two basic difference between habitat and niche. So again, students need not get confused about those two terms. When you say habitat, it is about the physical place where organisms live. When we say niche or niche, then it is about its role in that habitat, in that place where they live. So you find
it's overall survival, I would say, how
it's like that, because different organisms have different niche in an ecosystem or in a habitat, because of which they are able to exist. Right. Otherwise, if all the organisms, if all the animals have the same niche, then they will kill each other. There will be no more food, you know. They have to, how do they feed on the single source of food? So things have evolved in such a way that different organisms have different
in a
niche.
way, everything is linked, Dr. Shimre.
Of course.
I can recall your beads also, the green beads, the pink beads, that if something is growing on a rapid speed, it's going to take the other way. So there has to be a balance of everything.
Of course, yeah. So
you keep on repeating in every sessions that right from the evolution now to the environment, that there has to be a balance.
Yeah, so things are so connected. So we have studied about evolution, heredity and evolution. Now we are studying about ecosystem. Again, ecosystem has, I mean, the adaptation has occurred because of evolution, you know, because of its adaptation because of the natural selection. Right. So it's all connected. It's not like, oh, this is ecosystem, this is about ecology, that it was about genetics, you know. It's not that. There's even the subject disciplines are all linked up because we're studying about the same organisms, you know. It's just that for our convenience we call this genetics, we call this ecology, you know. So it's, but in nature it doesn't work that way. So the adaptation or the natural selection that we saw in heredity and evolution, so that is now we're observing that in this ecosystem or in the, you know, so in terms of its niche, because there are different I mean niche, different organisms have different niche because of which they're able to survive in that ecosystem or in that habitat. Otherwise, if they have the same niche, then imagine what could happen. You know, the resource will be so scarce that all those organisms will not exist. Only the strongest will exist.
Strongest would exist.
Yes. So that's how it works in nature. So these are simple terms that students might want to be familiar with. So then there's one more term that I'll take them to, reservoirs or sinks. So what are these? We talked about how organisms take their nutrients or the energy. So these nutrients, when they cycle, it cycles through abiotic and biotic components. And abiotic and biotic components, since they cycle through, I mean the nutrients cycle through this abiotic and biotic components, they are called reservoirs or sink of these nutrients. And they stay, these nutrients stay in those sinks, or they remain in those sinks for certain amount of time. For example, let's take an example of carbon. Carbon can be in the atmosphere. It can be in the atmosphere for some time. It can be in the human being as long as organisms, as well as long as we live. It can be stored in the bodies of different living organisms. Or it can be also in the soil, you know. So it's like, it can be, so reservoirs, it is same carbon, the nutrient is the same, it is a carbon, but it has different reservoirs at different points of time.
Right.
And the amount of time it spends depends upon, for example, if it is in a tree, then how long the tree survives. So that much time it will be there, the carbon will be there. So what I'm trying to say is that these reservoirs are not permanent. I mean, the nutrients keep on moving from one place to another. For example, from the atmosphere, then plants take in by means of carbon dioxide when they photosynthesize. Then after that, they have those plants, have those carbon in their body in the form of sugars. Then other consumers, they feed on them. And so that again, that nutrient in the form of carbon is again taken up in different organisms. So it moves on, but it changes its place, you know. So the nutrients changes its place. Sometimes it is in the abiotic component, that is the non-living component. Sometimes it is in the living component, you know. Sometimes it is in the air, sometimes it is in the living organism, sometimes it is in the soil. So it keeps on cycling. And so those, wherever it is present, that is a reservoir. So it can be the reservoir for carbon can be air, atmosphere, or reservoir for carbon can be organisms, living organisms. Reservoir can be the soil, you know. So this is another term that they might want to be familiar with. Okay, so maybe we should now go to what the components of ecosystem are. So we have been using this word now. We actually don't have to explain now because we have used this so many times. Biotic components, which are the living organisms, comprising of the living organisms, or the abiotic components, physical factors like temperature, rainfall, winds, soil, and minerals. All these non-living components in an ecosystem. So ecosystem is made out of biotic as well as abiotic components which interact. As we said, interaction is very important. So this biotic and abiotic components interact amongst themselves, and so that forms the ecosystem. So I'll not spend much time on that. We'll just move ahead with this. So how does this ecosystem function? It is very important to understand this because this is going to tell the students about how things work in the ecosystem. They now know the components, biotic components, which are the living components, and they also know that there are also non-living components in the ecosystem, which makes the ecosystem possible. Because if there are no soil, air, water, and all this, then ecosystem will not function. And so the ecosystem definitely requires, I mean, it comprises of abiotic and biotic components. So how does ecosystem function? Let's discuss a little bit about that. So it all starts with energy. So the trigger is the energy, because everything has to start with energy. Without energy, the ecosystem is not going to function. So it all starts with energy. And so how does this happen? So this energy is captured from the sun by photosynthetic plants, for plants which photosynthesize. So they take, we all we have been talking about photosynthesis since class 6 or 7 maybe. So plants take up this energy from the sun and they undergo this process of photosynthesis, through which they produce the food for themselves as well as for other organisms. So ecosystem function, it all starts with energy. Energy is a trigger to start running the ecosystem. Then after that, things fall in place. So basically there are two fundamental processes that's happening in an ecosystem. One is a nutrient cycle. The other one is the energy flow. Nutrient cycle, students have again studied about nutrient cycle in class 9 when they studied about the biogeochemical cycles. For example, the carbon cycle, nitrogen cycle, phosphorus cycle, and all those cycles that they studied in class 9. So that is part of the nutrient cycle. So these nutrients, they move in cycle. For example, they move from, we just took an example of carbon a few minutes ago. So they go through this cycle. For example, from the atmosphere, plants take in those carbon dioxide, then they produce food, then they die, then eventually the decomposers, they feed on them, they decompose them, the detritivores, they feed on them, the decomposers decompose them, then it goes back to the soil. So this kind of cycle goes on, and so we use the term cycle when we talk about nutrients. Nutrients can be like carbon and nitrogen, all those things that which they studied in class 9. So we are not going to discuss about this nutrient cycle in this session or even in the next session. We are going to focus on the energy flow, which they have not studied. So what is this energy flow? So energy enters the ecosystem from solar radiation, obviously from the sun, and it is passed on to the next organisms, out from the plants, then to the next higher organisms as they feed on those organisms. So that's how energy flows. But as energy flows from one level to the another level, it is also lost. So it is lost in the form of heat. So it is lost in the form of heat. That means that all the energy that the plants had taken from the sun, it is not transferred to the consumers which feed those animals which feed on the plants. So some of those energy, most of those energy is lost, in fact. So that's what is happening. And so what we finally say is that nutrients, they cycle, but energy flow. Nutrients cycle because it comes back to its original place. For example, carbon cycle we just mentioned, from atmosphere it goes to the living organisms, and from the living organisms it goes to the soil, then it goes to the atmosphere again, you know. So it goes on like this. It kind of takes a cycle. So that's why we use the term nutrient cycle with the nutrients, but never with energy, because energy is not cycled like nutrients. So energy is lost, but then it's not that it's no more there. It's there in different form, but in terms of ecosystem, it's no more available. And so we use the term energy flow, but nutrient cycle. So students might be interested to keep in mind those two words, nutrient cycle and energy flow. So I'll take the some more words in there. For example, ecosystem, we have been using the word ecosystem. So there are certain organisms living in that ecosystem. For example, you have the producers, you have the consumers, you have the detritivores, you have the decomposers. So producers, as students know, these are plants which capture the solar energy and they make food for themselves as well as for the consumers. Consumers are those which eat on those plants, or the producers, you know, and so that's how they get their energy and nutrients. Then this includes all kinds of animals and all kinds of fungus and bacteria and protozoa. Then the detritivores, these are also consumers, but they feed on the dead organic matter. So this could include worms, insects and crabs and many other organisms. Then there is another set of organisms that's part of the ecosystem, very important, decomposers. So these are the organisms which break down the organic matter, and it converts all this organic matter in the form in which plants can again take them up again, so that the cycle can continue, the nutrient cycle can continue. So these are different kinds of types of organisms that we normally see in an ecosystem. So ecosystem will more or less have all of this components. Producers will be definitely there, plants will be definitely there which will produce the food. Then you'll have the consumers of different levels. Consumers can be of 1 level, 2 level, 3 level, depending upon what kind of ecosystem it is. Then they will have detritivores which feed on the dead organic matter. Then there will be decomposers definitely. So this set of kinds of organisms will be present, groups of organisms will be present in an ecosystem. Then there is this food chain that students again are very familiar with this term. So what is this food chain? It is a simple linear path starting with plant, and it moves on. So it's like plants make the food, then the consumers eat on them, then the consumers are fed upon another set of consumers again. So it's like a linear path, or a linear path, a simple linear path that is from who eats what, you know, from the plants, the next level which eats those next level, and say it goes on like that. So that constitutes the food chain. So there can be dozens of individual food chains in an ecosystem. For example, if I show you this, so this is one of those pictures that depicts an ecosystem. So how does energy flow in an ecosystem? This picture depicts that. So as you can see in this picture, starting from the bottom, you can see the sun there. The energy enters the ecosystem. This energy enters into the ecosystem, into the plants. The plants photosynthesize and produce food. So these plants, the producers, they form the trophic level 1. Then this trophic level 1, the producers are eaten by, are consumed by consumers, which are called primary consumers, since they are the first level of consumers. So let's term them trophic level 2. So these primary consumers feed on the producers. Then the secondary consumers feed on the primary consumers, and it goes on. So it can be like tertiary. It not necessarily that all the ecosystem will have 5 different levels of trophic levels, not necessary. But in this example, we have shown that there are 5 levels, and so all these consumers, including the producer, when they die, decomposers on the left hand side, you can see there, the decomposers decompose them. Detritivores, they consume those, and the consumers that feed on the dead matter from every trophic level. We just define what detritivores are, which feed on that organic matter. Then the decomposers, like we mentioned about the microbes, they decompose them. Then after that, all those consumers and producers which have died are now decomposed, are now into a form. It is sent back to the soil in the form which plants again can take, and so the cycle continues. As you can see in the bottom left, bottom box, you can see the arrow coming out from the right hand side of the box. So it goes back to the first level, first trophic level, that is the producers. So now whatever was there in the ecosystem after they die, they are decomposed. Then ultimately the nutrients are now available back again to the plants for their consumption to make food again. On the right hand side, as you can see, most of the energy is lost in every trophic level. So there is energy loss at every trophic level. For example, we can see there 90% is lost in the first level. Again, in the second level, 90% of that 10% that remain is lost. And so this goes on. And that is the reason that you cannot have so many trophic levels, because energy is lost in every trophic level. As you can see in the box, most energy is lost as heat, because when we are doing some work, even when we are talking, we are losing some heat from our body. Similarly, different organisms, when different their cells function also, they lose some heat. So energy is lost in the process. Right. And that is the reason we say that there is approximately 10% is retained, otherwise 90% of the energy is lost in the process. So it's not sacrosanct, this 10% is not sacrosanct, it is just an approximation, it depends upon the ecosystem. So this is how energy flows in an ecosystem from one trophic level to the next.
To the other.
Yes.
Yes.
So
Dr. Shimre, we just have 2 minutes left for the session. I've been getting so many questions. I'll take up a question.
Sure.
Ashish Yadav is writing to us from Chandigarh. He wants to ask you why biome is considered so important.
See, we have been defining these terms, for example, the biomes or the biosphere or the ecosystem. So all these things are very important because they constitute the, it is where biomes, as we define, how did we define biomes? It is that portion of the biosphere which had distinct, climate. So unless we take care of these biomes, as you say, as we based on the definition, we can say that our biosphere is made up of different biomes. So if we don't take care of one biome, then that biome will be lost. For example, the terrestrial biome that can be lost if you don't take care of that. So it's like it is their part of the biosphere, and we have to ensure that we do not disturb that biome or how things work in that biome. As far as possible, our attempt should be not to disturb them. But since we are living in those biomes, some way we are interacting with those biomes. Of course, other organisms are also interacting in that biome. But then we are the ones who can actually manipulate, we do whatever we can do with the things that are present in the biome. So our attempt should be to take care of those biomes and leave it as natural as possible so that the biome survives. Biome has to survive. Otherwise, if you manipulate some portion of the biome in such a way that it is beyond control, then the biome itself will no more exist. It will be so much so that then all the organisms and things will be like in haywire. And so you want to make sure that you take care of
We still
all those
have
things.
a minute left. A small question to you by Vanshika Gupta from Jaipur, Rajasthan. She wants to ask you, there's a confusion, madam. How should we consider coal biotic or abiotic?
Biotic, as we said, it is the living component of an ecosystem. Abiotic is a non-living component. Non-living component can be anything. Your soil, your rocks, your pebbles, your air, your water, anything that is non-living but which is part of the ecosystem is the abiotic component. Whereas the biotic component is any living organism. It can be microbes, it can be big animals, small animals, animals which cannot be seen by eyes, tiny insects, anything that's living, it is part of the biotic component.
Okay. So that's it for today, I guess. We'll be taking up this chapter further in follow-up sessions, of course. And it was really wonderful to have you. Time to time you come to the studio and you offer your generous support to students. Kishore Manch thanks you for joining us today.
Thank you. Thank you.
And you be with us, students, because the next session is going to be for primary level students. We are going to discuss mental and health well-being of our students. So kindly be with us. We'll be coming in a short while. Thank you.